In this video I will show you exactly how I edited this photo. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing I always do is to adjust the crop, and for this one I will just crop out the border here because it is a HDR image and I stitched I think 5 different exposures for this image. So the next step for me is to apply a preset. You can also edit the photo completely from scratch without a preset, but it will just take a lot more time and you will have to spend more time on figuring out which settings work on the photo. So for me the easiest thing is just to look at my presets and see which preset works the best, and in this case this is the Bluetouch preset. For me the preset is always the base for the image and the foundation, and from there I do some small adjustments to the exposure, saturation or stuff like that, and then I also usually add some masking and sometimes I also do some cleanup, and if it's really complicated I also throw the image into Photoshop to make it easier for me to clean up some larger things in the image I don't want to have. So while I think the exposure is already pretty good, I think we definitely have to add some masking here because it's just way too bright here on the street and it takes some of the attention away from the black car here, and we don't want that. For me, when I edit an image, it's always about how can I direct the viewer's eye towards the subject, and in this case, because the street is so bright, it takes the attention away from the black car here, and it also fades a bit in the background because the building is also black. So there is some work to do in the masking. So let's go to the masking here and add a linear gradient at first, and I would just drag it up maybe towards the top of the car here, and then I would subtract the subject here and decrease the exposure, maybe like this. Yeah, I think this is looking pretty good. Now the next thing that's bothering me is that the car is a little bit dark here and a little bit too bright here. So the problem is that it's fading into the background on both sides and we don't want that. So let's add a object mask here and draw over the car here and hope it does a good job, and yeah, I think that's pretty good. Now I would subtract this mask with a linear gradient only to this part where the car is really dark, and then we will increase the shadows a little bit and maybe also the exposure just a little bit. The next thing is to duplicate this mask and do the same with the other side, but this time I would decrease the exposure, and I think that's looking pretty good. Maybe we could actually increase the shadows a little bit more on this side and then duplicate this mask here where we decrease the exposure on the street, and let's invert the subject mask here so that it's only affecting the car, and then just decrease the amount to where it's looking right. Because the problem with what we did earlier is that the car often looks like it's floating when you subtract the subject from the linear gradient, and it just looks unrealistic when it's super bright here and then it gets really dark on the street here. So I often like to compensate that with a inverted mask on the subject, which is only affecting the subject, and then I would just decrease the amount of the mask a little bit so that it's looking realistic. So maybe 30 or something is looking quite good for this image here, and I think the bottom here looks quite good now. What's bothering me is the top here and also this bright spot here. So let's add a linear gradient for the top here and also subtract the subject and decrease the exposure a little bit. Maybe also just the highlights, maybe like this. And for the bright spot here I would add a sky mask The problem is with the sky mask here, it's not doing a great job, so I would just subtract it with a linear gradient to just affect this bright area I talked about earlier, and then we can just decrease the exposure to where it's looking good, maybe like this. And then we could also add a linear gradient here to direct the viewer's eyes even more towards the subject, and then just decrease the exposure, maybe like this, and also subtract the street here because then the street is getting too dark here. But what I'm noticing now is that the street is still a bit bright, and we could decrease the exposure just a little bit more on the street to make the photo look even more dramatic. And what I also often like to do is add a object mask on the car and increase the clarity, because often this looks quite good on cars. It's just a subtle thing, but I think it's giving a little bit of a crispier look. Now the last step is to clean up some of the distracting things in the image. So for example, here is a spot on the street that I don't like, and I also don't like this pole here. Those are just a few things I would remove to increase the focus on the subject even more and just make it look more professional. So for the small things, I would just grab the remove tool here, the healing tool, and remove those things on the street. And this one could maybe also work with the remove tool. Just brush over it, and yeah, I mean, it's not looking perfect, but you don't notice it. The next thing that is bothering me is this pole here, and also this other pole, and actually also this tree here, because this tree, I mean, you could leave it, but the problem is that it's directly behind the car, and it kind of looks like the car has this pole here, and that just looks weird and unprofessional. So I would try to remove that. The problem is it is directly behind the car. So when we use the healing brush, for example, the problem is that it will remove the lights here and it will just look bad. So this is something we have to do in Photoshop, unfortunately, but the rest I think we can do in Lightroom. So let's grab the remove tool and use generative AI for this, and select this pole here and hope that AI will do a good job. Usually it does, but sometimes it can also mess up and then you will have to do it again. This time I think it worked really well here, and let's do the same also for this pole in the background here. I would decrease the highlights a little bit. That's just something I just noticed, and I think that's looking a little bit better maybe. It's not a big difference, but yeah, that's it for Lightroom. Let's do the final step in Photoshop and remove this tree here. This will be a little bit more complicated, but just stay with me. I will take you step by step on how I will remove something like this. So for the final step, we go into Photoshop by right-clicking onto the image and then choose edit in Adobe Photoshop, and it will open Adobe Photoshop. So in Photoshop, the first thing we will have to do is to duplicate the layer to create a layer where only the car is visible. So for this, I usually use the object selection tool here and just click on the car. Usually it does a good enough job, and then you just select inverse here and remove the background. So now you have this layer with just a car, which is important when we will remove the tree here. So let's hide the layer for now and click on the first layer. And the first thing I would do is just use generative AI here to remove the tree. And maybe you could write something like remove, but usually writing nothing is enough. So now it's done, but this is exactly the problem. It will remove also some of the car and make the edges look weird of the car. So that's something we definitely don't want. So that's why we created this layer with just the car. So let's enable this layer again. And maybe we could remove some of the generative AI on the side here. So let's grab the eraser here and just brush over it. so we don't have these weird artifacts here on the side. And I think that's looking pretty good. The last thing I am noticing is this vignette on the car. It just doesn't look that good. So let's grab the healing tool here and remove the vignette here like this. That's it. The final step is just to close Photoshop again and save the file. Then it will take us back to Lightroom and we can export the photo from here. And that's it for today's editing breakdown. If you want to check out the presets I use for all of my photos, check the link in the description and I will see you in the next one. Bye.